Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik from Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it. Hey everyone, welcome to the Figure It Outcast for February 2024. I am your host, Adam Koralik, and I am joined by the apparently eternal Joseph Tamburino. Welcome back, Joseph.
Thanks, Adam. Glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad you are here because no one else is. We've had a very weird morning. We were set up for... All right, so what we were supposed to have happen here is Abdullah was supposed to join us, Rob was supposed to join us, and the whole usual, adventure that goes with that. But Rob woke up, he's like, guys, I think I have the flu or COVID or something. So he's like, his throat was all messed up, so he's like, I can't really record. And we're like, that's all right, man, we'll handle it for you. And then Abdullah messages me like 20 minutes before we're supposed to record, and he's like, hey, I'm not hurt or anything, but I got into a car accident and that's kind of ruined my whole day, so there's no way I'm going to be able to make it. So Joseph, I appreciate you kind of pinch hitting here for everybody, and it's just going to be the two of us, so that'll happen. We've got 4 subjects. And if you guys are unaware, you're brand new to this is a Patreon-backed podcast, so we appreciate the support in not only supporting the channel, but if you do that, you can get early access to this, as well as all my videos. You can get shout-outs, you can get subjects selected, or you can even be on the podcast, which of course would have been the case with Abdullah. But Joseph, you will have to step in there, and I appreciate you doing that. So, the first subject that we have here would have been Abdullah's, although he didn't have one, so we picked one for him, and he's not here to talk about it anyway, so it doesn't really matter. But I think Joseph and we can have a fun time talking about it. I thought it would be just kind of interesting to spend a few minutes talking about the current state of physical media. Because, obviously I assume a lot of people that listen to this or watch this channel are proponents of the concept of physical media. Certainly I am. And it's taken quite a few hits already in 2024. The first thing up was how Best Buy basically started pulling, everything. They're not selling Blu-rays and DVDs and things like that anymore. Not too long ago, we had some reports that Microsoft was definitely shrinking down their physical Xbox division, particularly the area that handles indies, although that doesn't necessarily mean they're not going to produce physical discs anymore. It's just that they're even reducing the priority to what little it had. We're seeing more and more studios and things talking about not having physical editions of things, both in the video game realm as well as the film and television realm. Although, ironically, music is doing better. There's way more vinyls than ever before. But, I don't know. What do you have a take on this? I know you're not as physical of a guy, so, what do you think?
Well, I think the current state of physical media, honestly, is in a very bad place right now. I was originally just going to open this up by making a joke saying, it sucks, next topic, but you then explained it in more detail before I started, so I guess we'll have the actual discussion. Like you said, the only thing that seems to actually be in a good spot is vinyl, and that's because vinyl's neat. In theory it does sound better, but nowadays, all of the mastering, all the work on the music is done digitally and then put on the vinyl. So it's not like you're going straight analog to analog anymore with that. But, like you said, Best Buy not selling Blu-rays. Disney not producing Blu-rays in Australia. Stores...
I forgot about that one.
Massively reducing Xbox physical game stock from what I could see with all the pictures of the completely empty Xbox sections. Alan Wake 2, no physical edition.
What was the whole deal with Starfield's physical edition?
It existed. That's all I know. I could go look that up real quick.
Yeah, I remember there being something to that, but it is funny, you mentioned the vinyl thing as well. I know I brought it up initially, but yesterday, the missus and I were at a Barnes & Noble's of all things, and they sell tons of vinyl there, and I actually sat there and I was looking through them, actually fascinated, but I have to admit, I didn't really bother to look through the movies. I don't know why that is, because I'm not even a music guy, but something about vinyl records I find fascinating. I do tend to enjoy the audio of it better, but you're absolutely right that we live in an age now where nothing is a true analog master because they recorded digitally from the inception anyway. At least,
I have a record player. I have a bunch of vinyl stuff. If a music soundtrack comes out and I want to buy it, I get it on vinyl.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, exactly. I think the last one I got was like I got Back to the Future score on vinyl, which was nice. But yeah, so with the physical state, the state of physical media, we're kind of in this weird. I'm hoping, and I guess I don't know this, but I'm kind of hoping it's a weird transition phase, at least as far as film and television and goes, because you can kind of look to, ironically, funny enough, vinyl as like kind of a model for this. If you were like in the 90s, vinyl was a completely dead format. Obviously CDs were still popular. There were physical editions of it, but every once in a while we have a tendency to kind of circle back around to stuff. The other thing that's been happening while physical media has been taking a hit is we've also simultaneously seen a lot of digital distribution problems. Like literally at the time of recording this, it was like 2 days ago, Sony and Crunchyroll or whatever, they just decided, oh yeah, all this content you bought, you don't really own. Again,
right, with the whole Funimation Now shut down and all your digital Funimation anime copies going bye-bye. Yeah,
exactly. And so every time that sort of thing happens, you do have this wake-up call from a whole bunch of people who are like, wait a minute, I thought I bought it. And I'm always like, no.
I don't know how much of an actual effect the Funimation thing has, like, because I had a bunch of those, but they were all codes that were just distributed as part of the physical release I bought. Like, I never actually paid for a digital copy on Funimation's site.
That's fair. And I mean, personally, I wouldn't buy any anime anyway, so it's not me, obviously. I'm just saying it's more about the, let's say, the Twitterati, the response that comes from the idea that these servers where people believe they've got property and it suddenly isn't there anymore. That every time that happens, and this has happened a few times already in 2024, that does seem to give a shot in the arm to physical media a bit, because you get more and more people who are like, wait a minute, maybe I'll just go back to my discs because they don't do this. And I don't know, man. I'm not saying that physical is by any means going to win out here. I still think digital streaming and digital distribution is going to win just because, yeah, exactly.
Because the stores still have to actually sell it, and the content makers still have to make it.
Precisely.
And they're not going to.
They're not going to soon enough, but I do think there's a possibility of let's say a more niche resurgence. Again, the way vinyl is. Like, it is entirely possible in not, super soon. I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. Night, darkest before the dawn type of logic here. Where eventually, on the other side of that, you'll be able to go into something like a Barnes & Nobles, and they will have a Blu-ray section of the latest things that are, the popular things that went into theaters not too long ago or are big on streaming. And then the only time you'll get physicals of like indie movies will be something like Shout Factory or, some of those little companies that are able to produce something. Just accept that the days of like going into a store and being able to pick up like $5, gamble movies like on Blu-ray or whatever, probably going away. It'll probably be like, okay, you can have a physical edition of like some art house indie movie, but it's going to cost you like $60 or something. And you might be able to still get, a reasonably priced, big tentpole blockbuster film, but it will be considered a niche thing. Much like if I wanted to right now, I actually could go out and get a vinyl record of the score for Guardians of the Galaxy 3. Like that is a thing.
Yeah.
It's just that you wouldn't expect it to be a thing anymore, but it is. Well, and it probably costs like 40, 50, 60 bucks, something like that. It probably will be somewhere along those lines. I'm not saying that's going to happen now. That's probably like 10 years away. But until then, it's probably going to get a lot worse, actually, where it's just less and less stuff is going to get these editions. And I know people are here more to talk about video games, where video games are complicated and people don't tend to understand this, because I see people bring this up in the comments a lot. They're like, well, that's okay if they don't produce them, because eventually other people produce like new Xbox discs. I'm like, you don't get it. Blu-rays, DVDs, etc. While it's not an open source format, it is more of an open license format, whereas you just pay like a minimal fee and like anybody can pump content onto it. PS5 discs, even though they're both Sony in that case, because Sony owns Blu-ray, they don't just let anybody produce content for it. And it's especially true of Microsoft. They are very much like, hey, this is locked. You have to go through us, which is why even like limited run games has barely been able to release anything from them. I mean, if you need further proof of that, like look at Nintendo. Like people wanted actively to continue to make physical Wii U games just to have a bunch of indies on there, and Nintendo wouldn't allow it. But yeah, Nintendo wouldn't allow it at a certain point. So video games are unfortunately an extremely locked format, except for exploits, but that's obviously a whole different thing.
Right.
But basically, you need the good graces of whichever company is making the system in order to continue to pump content onto it. That's how it's always been. And unfortunately for that, I don't see any sort of positive outcome anytime soon, because I don't see any sort of return to physical media. As it is, physical media on game consoles is very, very gimped.
Yeah, like you never have, you rarely, if ever, have a fully working game just out of the disc without a day one patch, except for Nintendo stuff. A lot of the times, like, I'll put a game in, it's like, okay, I'll go ahead and oh, there is no patch. Neat.
Yeah, Nintendo's the least guilty of it, but even they are guilty of it.
I mean, it's not all the time, but like last game from them I got, Super Mario Wonder, I put it in there and it was like, oh, the game's just complete and it doesn't have a day one patch. Okay, neat.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, then it still has patches, but like,
of course,
the game functioned on day one without a patch is what I'm getting at.
Yeah, I got you. I don't know if this is still their policy. I know at a time, companies like Special Reserve Games and Limited Run Games, etc., their policy was they only wanted completed games put on physical discs. But they've also expanded substantially over the years since then, so I have no idea if that's still true.
Yeah, I don't think that's fully true anymore. I think for the most part, Limited Run will still do that, but I think there's at least been a couple of games where that hasn't been the case.
Oh, I'm sure. But yeah, that's unfortunately the place we're at with video games, but it may not matter much, because if we even, we're jumping subjects here, but like if we were to hypothetically talk about next generation hardware, assuming Xbox has one, which is a whole different discussion we'll save for later. Mm-hmm. I would bet on all digital from them. Sony, I'm not totally sure. Nintendo, I definitely see doing another physical iteration for sure.
Well,
yeah. Although that in of itself could be a weird subject, because now that the flash cards are out there, the Switch has gotten a little bit more complicated, and their physical media is probably the worst of all of them. Are you familiar with this? Like the MIG Switch thing?
I heard of it.
All right, so the MIG Switch, for those who don't know, is a flash card essentially for the Nintendo Switch, but it works a little uniquely in the sense that flash cards or games for the Switch, every single game has an individual ID, like serial number certificate on it. And it's not just like, 2 copies of, Super Mario Odyssey have the same key or whatever. Like, literally every single copy of every single game ever produced for the Nintendo Switch has a completely unique identifying serial number. And
that's how their coin redemption thing works.
Precisely. So if you actually go ahead and like clone that data over to a flash card, as long as the 2 copies aren't trying to run at the same time or whatever, then Nintendo isn't necessarily aware of it. However, we have now reached a point where if someone decided, like, say I have like a whole bunch of Switch games, right? Let's say I got a MIG Switch and I cloned all my games to it, and then I decided, okay, I have all my games on this flash card, I don't want the physicals anymore, like for some reason, and I sold them all to GameStop or whatever. That means if I play them online on my MIG Switch or connect online, download updates, whatever it is, if somebody goes out and buys what used to be my physical copy of, again, Super Mario Odyssey or whatever, and they try to use it online, they'll have the exact same certificate as my clone copy, which means there's a potential that their copy gets banned, as well as my copy. Now, in my case, whatever, it's a ROM file, I guess I don't really care. But in their case, they legitimately bought a legitimate physical copy that will stop working. Mm-hmm. And that is another horrifying concern for the state of physical media, where if you make it to the point where it's so restricted that every copy is that unique, it kind of will break the system a bit. So, the Switch game is a little poisoned at this point, because now we've reached a point where you can't necessarily trust the used Switch market at all. And that's a whole different discussion that we could have. But, yeah, physical media is not in a great place right now. It's really the point I'm trying to make. Yeah, well, I guess we can move on, and we'll leave you guys with that kind of ominous feeling. So thank you, Abdullah, even though you weren't here to talk about it. We do appreciate you all the same. And hope you're all right, man. Like, I know he said he's okay, but like, yeah, that'll ruin anybody's day. He was coming out of Comic-Con out in the UAE, and then somebody hit him in like car accident, and yeah, so that'll screw up your whole day.
Yep.
But yeah, any other thoughts on this?
No, I think we pretty much covered everything on the physical media side.
All right, then. So we'll move on. Our next subject comes from a Patreon backer named Spencer per year. And he said, this was another one I thought would be really good for Abdullah because he's such a big fan of Nintendo stuff. But he basically just wanted to know, in a fantasy world, what would you want the Switch successor to be? So get rid of any realm of reality here. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, we know Nintendo won't do this, the X, Y, and Z, whatever it is. In a fantasy world, what would you want the next system from them to be? And then I guess we can have the discussion about what do you actually think it would be.
Okay.
What do you think? Yeah.
So, fantasy world. I guess the first thing I should say for a Switch successor is I want it to be more powerful than the PS5, and I still want it to be portable, and I want it to not melt down when it tries to do that.
I think that's reasonable.
Yeah. Well, when I say portable, I want it to be how it is now with the dock and the, and play on the TV, play portably if you want it. But,
sure.
Other than that, I don't really want Nintendo to do anything weird with the Switch successor. They have a pretty winning formula right now, arguably. Then I don't want them to screw it up, which, they have a tendency to do after a successful console.
That they do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's usually the rule of threes. So the third one is usually the one where you screw up somewhere. But in that case, it was the N64, because they stuck with cartridges even though everyone told them not to, and that created the greatest rival they've ever known, the PlayStation. And then eventually they came around and they screwed up again with the Wii U, even though I love that system. It undeniably was a flop. So they should be fine for now, but we'll see how it goes. But then again, that's just historical patterns.
I mean, you could argue that they didn't do it in threes with the Wii and Wii U. It was like one good one and then one bad one. But
you can put it into family blocks if you prefer, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
granted,
honestly,
that depends on how you view the GameCube. Like, if you
precisely.
view the GameCube as a success, then, yeah, it's rule of threes. If you view it as a failure, which is very dumb because, I mean, everything's a failure compared to the PS2. That doesn't necessarily mean it lost money or did badly for what it was. But that's completely off topic.
Yeah, exactly. The problem is all these are just historical patterns, or they're historical events that we're trying to put into patterns.
Right.
There is some logic to it, but yeah, it's just kind of waxing inane, but it's fun to do all the same. That said, as far as a Switch successor in a fantasy world, I mean, the fantasy for me would be like, okay, I completely agree with you on a dock, continue to do the same basic concept of the Switch. Yes, you'd want to have it something to be, I'd actually, if we're going fantasy, I want PS6 in my pocket. I don't even care. Go to the next level. And then I want it to have, because it's going to have, I want it to obviously be backwards compatible with the Switch, natively, cart slot. But because, again, fantasy, this is ridiculous, I want a disc drive on it that plays Wii U, Wii, even though I hate it, GameCube games. I want cartridge slots for the N64, Super Nintendo, Famicom, NES, Game Boy. Bring it all on. DS, let's do it. I want something that is ridiculous, that is obviously never going to happen, so it's kind of absurd. So let's be more practical about it. In a practical sense, what I kind of would expect out of them is something very much the Switch concept again, possibly with a greater distinction between the docked mode and the portable mode. Like, as it is, the only real difference between playing portably and docked is that when it's docked, it has a little bit more juice so it can perform a little better, and that's about it.
Yeah.
Aside from the fact that you're obviously holding it versus playing it on a television. It would be interesting if in docked mode it could do more. Like if you had effectively you had two screens. Like, take the Wii U concept of, you have a screen on the television and you have the one portably. And you could do that essentially while it's docked. So you could actually have two screens there. Or if you're going into portable mode, it just kind of consolidates the game down to one. I think that would be more fascinating. I'm not really sure how you would execute that, to be honest with you, but like I'm just saying that I'm not the engineer. It's just kind of a mental thought. It would be interesting to see that because that would allow compatibility with obviously Switch content. It would give something new and unique while also being able to kind of recycle some of their additional Wii U library. And if they really wanted to, it gives them very easy ability to resell everybody DS and 3DS stuff. But and then if they really wanted to, they can also sell other content. But I would like to see that. I also think from a capability standpoint, the best case scenario you're really realistically going to get would be like a PS4 Pro in your pocket. Maybe PS4 Pro when it's docked, PS4 when it's not. Although that would be a little underpowered in my opinion, but
well,
I don't know.
Nintendo. I mean,
yeah, exactly. But like the thing is, the Switch itself is, I mean, it's not. Its nearest neighbor is the Wii U, and then right after that would be like, I mean, it's like a hair under the Xbox One base model, isn't it? So like, it doesn't take that much of a leap to get up to a base PS4 from there, theoretically. But having taken 8 years or so to do that would be kind of excessive. But I don't know. Yeah. That's Nintendo. You're right. So yeah, maybe PS4 Pro in your pocket is probably the most realistic. Maybe if it's docked, you have more like an Xbox One X in your pocket.
Well, not in your pocket in that case.
Well, not in my pocket if it's docked. Yeah. All right. How about that? PS4 Pro in your pocket, Xbox One X when connected to a television. Let's go with that. Why not?
Yeah, that's probably the best case scenario as far as power goes. Like,
yes.
Like, hopefully they'll actually, like, instead of just letting the Switch upclock when it's docked, or the Switch 2 rather, they'll like actually like maybe put in like a second like GPU or something in the dock itself.
Mm-hmm.
That could give it more power. Although, or rather like an external, less the second one and more an external one that's used when it's docked instead. Because if you have two GPUs and then it's docked, then you have to have people actually program it for multiple GPUs, and that's going to be a Sega Saturn headache. So
yeah. What they might do instead is something like post-processing, like something like, like imagine a Nintendo Switch dock where something like the M Classic was like built right into it. Now I realize that's not exactly the same thing, but like, that concept of you put it in the dock and there's just more to it. Because I agree with you. If you use a second GPU that developers have to take advantage of when it's specifically in the dock, they may ignore it a lot of the time. And it may be one of those things where it just kind of never went anywhere. Unless Nintendo kind of forced everybody to use it, but then that would just piss off developers. But then again, that's Nintendo. Yeah. They don't really care if they piss off developers. So I don't know. That's a mixed bag one. As far as, additional capabilities, I'm trying to think of what else they could do that would be like somewhat unique and interesting. And at the moment, the thing I like is really the idea of, utilizing two screens, but only when, you have the option to. Essentially doing, kind of what PS5 Portal is, or / the Wii U did do originally. Maybe you basically take the Wii U concept and you make it less of a requirement and more of an option, and just see how that goes.
I just don't know how they implement that with like the Switch model, because I mean, if it's docked, it's docked. I mean, you're not going to be able to really see the second screen.
Right. No, but here's my thoughts on that. What if, imagine the Nintendo Switch as you currently know it. It's just the screen. It has like the two, controllers, the Joy-Cons attached to the side of it. Now imagine, how it has that USB-C port on the bottom of it? Mm-hmm. Imagine if all you had to do is just plug that via a cable into the dock and it is docked. Like that's all it needs. So now the thing can function as a controller and a second screen.
Okay, yeah, that would work. I mean...
Or, even better, because we live in a more wireless, era, what if it's literally just like, it just can sync through that same way, just not, say, Bluetooth, but some sort of data communication that is like that when the dock is functional. Like, that's really all I'm trying to get at, I guess.
So, so instead of it being a dock, it's more like you get up two boxes, one of them's like hooked up to the TV, the other one's the portable thing, and they can sync up together.
Yeah, and you can think of the let's call it the Switch 2, even though they would never call it that. Well, they're Nintendo, maybe they would. They'd probably call it Switch New, but
Yeah.
You laugh because you know it's not entirely impossible. But if they did do that, you basically would think of quote-unquote Switch New as a controller that also is the game system. And then the dock, yes, is like an additional powerhouse that just allows it to communicate with the television. But then because it's connected to that, it can do additional things, and it can have, dual screens and everything that's beneficial that comes with that. So anything that would take advantage of the dual screens would have to run through the second, the box connected TV. So like, not that they would natively put a Wii U disc drive on it and you could suddenly play games through that, but like anything where if they were like, oh, we're going to do some sort of USB adapter that allows like 3DS cards to work, which they would never do.
No,
then it would
3DS is dead at this point. They'd never do that.
No. The era of, hey, let's put an add-on to something to make retro content work, that is over. They instead, even Nintendo has finally figured out they can just resell you like ROMs of stuff and people will pay them, so they do it rather than releasing any hardware to go with it, which is sad, but it is what it is. So I personally think that would be, I guess, my realistic yet kind of fantasy option for a quote-unquote Switch New would be this dual screen concept where the system is also the controller, where it can kind of become both. And of course, if you want to play it with a controller, you can do that as well. Like, let's keep that around. I'm not saying you're forced to use this thing all the time, because that was one of the big issues with the Wii U, is that people perceived that the gamepad was the only way to play it, and people just looked at it and like, I don't want to hold a tablet as a controller. I completely get that. So you have to make sure that's clear to everybody.
Yeah, not that the tablet was actually uncomfortable to hold. Honestly, I think it was more comfortable than the Switch.
I agree completely. I actually do. It's just that when people first look at it, they're just like, the idea that I'm going to play this game on a screen on the television, I'm forced to hold this big bulky tablet, or the gamepad, obviously, to do that was just, off-putting to a lot of people. But, I don't know. We'll see.
Yep.
Yeah, I guess that's really all I would say on it for now. I would expect Switch. I guess this is actually worth discussing. Do you think they would do Switch backwards compatibility, or do you think they would decide, let's risk it and just try to resell everybody's stuff?
They're going to do Switch backwards compatibility, unless if they do something really completely out of left field and completely change the format that games come on again. Like, unless if they go back, unless if they decide to go skip the whole portable thing and go back to disc, they're gonna do Switch backwards compatibility. They sold way too many Switches not to do that, at least for initially.
Yeah, I historically speaking, I think you're correct, but it's also Nintendo. They do a lot of stuff that's just kind of out of the left field, where you go like, really, and then they get away with it. I'm not saying, yeah. So I could see it. But we have to remember, Nintendo doesn't exactly have the best history with backwards compatibility. In their portables, they typically do. It's their consoles, they typically don't. It was really just the Wii supporting GameCube until they phased it out, and the Wii U supporting Wii. And the only reason they never phased it out, it didn't last that long. That was the only reason they didn't phase it out there. And it's also because they had to put in a bunch of Wii hardware anyway, because it had to be there. So that was it. They've never done it.
Yeah, I guess it's going to depend on what the underlying chip of this hypothetical Super Switch, Switch New, Switch 2 is. If it's an upgraded Tegra processor, then yeah, backwards compatibility is a no-brainer. Just downlock it to Switch specs and you're good. But if it's a completely different chip that's not even like an NVIDIA chip, that's going to be a much harder sell.
Exactly. So, I guess without any sort of information about the actual engineering that will go into this thing, and you're right about the chips, and obviously that's very, very important, but just as a fan looking at what I would think they would do from a marketing perspective, I think if they even remotely approach this as a handheld again, which is, to be fair, kind of how they did with the Switch initially, that they're going to continue, at least initially, with Switch support, backwards compatibility. However, I will say the only reason I think they would do that is if they decide to keep that specific cart shape. I don't think you're in a situation where, like when the DS came out and they had the DS slot on there, but they also gave you a Game Boy Advance slot. I don't think they're going to give you both.
No.
They're either going to use the same cart slot again and just kind of upgrade the tech itself. So it's essentially backwards compatible, but that's it. That's the only reason we're using that shape, is so that your original Switch stuff works. Or they're just going to say, you know what, we don't really care that you're not happy about it. We're going to do you got the Switch. There's 50 million of those things out there. No, it's 140 million or something like that.
Yep.
There's plenty of games. You can go play that system. This is a new system. We're starting all over. Again, it depends on how they approach it. If they approach it like a console as opposed to a handheld, it would not entirely shock me if they don't bother with the backwards compatibility. If they do approach it as a handheld, I could keep them seeing it. But I will say, you mentioned at the beginning of this subject, historically, when console companies make like a juggernaut success, and it's undeniable that the Switch is, they set out the next time doing some stupid stuff. And it would not, on that historical level alone, entirely shock me if they're like, the Switch is so successful that whatever we release next is going to be successful. We don't have to bother with this. Let's just resell everybody's stuff. So I don't know. I guess what I'm saying is I think they'll do it, but I'm not.
Considering the Switch's niche, I mean, for all we know, they could, if that's what they decide on, they could still be right. I mean,
yeah.
But that's actually something that we can go into in the next topic, honestly.
We could. So I guess on backwards compatibility, I can't believe I'm saying this. I'm only like 51-49 in favor of the idea that they will do it. I think they will, but like I barely think that, because pretty much every argument I can think of them doing it, I can also think of an argument for them not doing it. So, whatever. I guess this is one of those things you just kind of explore and you just learn about as you're talking about it, I suppose, if that makes any sense. But because you just try to get in the head of Nintendo and you realize like you can't. It's a weird, crazy place in there. So yeah, I guess that'll do it for that subject. If you're good.
Yeah, I think we're pretty good on that one too.
All right. Well, thank you very much to Spencer. We also have a round of shout-outs. The following people are all Patreon backers. They are at the level in which they get a shout-out. So we got a huge shout-out to Loke, Michael Kelly, Sega Steve, Tim Inman, and Trey Wagner. Once again, that is Loke, Michael Kelly, Sega Steve, Tim Inman, and Trey Wagner. If you would like to back this podcast on Patreon, I appreciate the support. Again, you can get early access to it and my other videos. You can get shout-outs as these wonderful people just did. Pick subjects such as Spencer did, or be on it such as Joseph. We appreciate it. Thank you very much. So again, Loke, Michael Kelly, Sega Steve, Tim Inman, Trey Wagner. Thank you so much for the support. Now, moving on. Joseph, it is your time to shine, my friend. This was your subject, so I'm just going to let you introduce it.
All right. So, there's been all the rumors about Microsoft and Xbox, and suddenly, are they going to go third party? Because you made a video on it like about a week ago. But my thought process with this, for what I want to talk about right now, let's just assume for a moment that the whole rumors about Microsoft dropping out of the console market are 100% true and are going to happen. What the hell happens with the industry after that's a thing?
Okay, so I'm with you. I just want to preface a lot to the audience right now.
Yes, please do.
At the time we're recording this, Phil Spencer has not yet had that conference where he's going to talk about whatever the future of Xbox is. So by the time you hear this, what we're saying could be absurdly, comically, astronomically out of date, and we are very aware of that. But at the moment we record it, there's nothing we can do about it. Second, there has been an update since where apparently Phil Spencer kind of told people internally, don't worry, we're not getting out of consoles. So most likely none of this is actually panning out anyway. So this discussion is purely for the entertainment purposes of discussing what if there really was a worst case scenario where we literally just one day we saw this tweet from Xbox and saying game over, and then just basically explained we're done, we're out. And I want to make sure it's clear, because I want to make sure I understand, Joseph. When you say they're out of console hardware and they transition to just doing software a la Sega? Or do you mean we are done? Microsoft as a corporation cares no more about video games whatsoever.
Software like Sega. Software only like Sega. There's no way in hell Microsoft is going to abandon gaming after the Activision Blizzard acquisition.
Okay, that's what I just want to make clear to the audience and to myself, because they're two very different things. Because not that we're talking about the latter, since it's not going to be that extreme. If that actually happened, where we just one day Microsoft's like, yeah, we're just not doing video games anymore. It's a fire sale. We're getting rid of all these IPs we just recruited. Everyone would think they were completely insane, and it would destroy a lot of things, because a lot of the IPs that they've absorbed just ultimately would end up in limbo somewhere. And probably never see the light of day again. So
and honestly, if that happens, the discussion is going to be less about video games and more about literally everything in the tech industry. So
yeah, that would be like a cataclysmic reaction. Like, that would be bad. So we'll approach it from the hypothetical. If Microsoft really did just say, hey, we're done with Xbox hardware, we're not done with Xbox as a brand, we're going to, it's going to be Game Pass, but we're going to continue to support the Xbox for, I don't know, probably the next 4 to 8 years, something like that. The current ecosystem as it is. So you're still going to get new games, you're still going to get your updates and all that stuff. Like, it'll feel pretty normal. We're just not going to make another piece of hardware after this. And Game Pass, etc., is going to appear on PlayStation. There will be a version for the Nintendo Switch, and certainly Switch New, or whatever the hell. PC, it'll go head to head with Steam. We'll even show up on iOS and Android. Why not? It'll be on everything. In that scenario, having made the video I did make and seeing the reactions, I saw that most people were not happy about this. Even a lot of people who came to me and said, like, dude, I'm a diehard PlayStation fan. I've never bought an Xbox. I've never liked the brand. This is not good news.
Yeah,
a lot of people were saying this is. It wouldn't be. A lot of them were saying this is really bad, because they were like, I love my PlayStation, or I love Nintendo, whatever it is, but they're like, one of the only thing that kind of keeps them in check a little bit is the fact that they have to compete with Microsoft. And Microsoft's cheat code Game Shark advantage has always been, no matter how bad their hardware is doing, it doesn't matter. You can't knock them out, because the money they've got behind them just keeps them honest and keeps them there. So Sony, even though they actually need the PlayStation brand, Nintendo obviously needs their gaming division, they had to be competitive with a company that didn't need the Xbox brand, and actually actively probably wants to get rid of it, as apparently is the case to some extent. So with that kind of balancing out, shall we say, the gaming economy, and this includes PCs, by the way, because a large part of what makes PC gaming affordable is not only the competition with consoles, but internal competition between, say, Steam and Epic Store and so on and so forth. Like, competition is always good. I think, Joseph, you and I probably very much agree on that. You know what's funny is that some guy commented about that, and he was like, competition isn't always good. He's like, don't you remember when Netflix was the only streaming service and everything was just so much better? And a bunch of people were like, yeah, but they had to compete with Blockbuster. Like, they've always had to compete with somebody.
Yeah, they weren't competing with other streaming services. They were competing with physical rental services. But they were still competing.
Yeah, always. Competition is always good for the consumer. Trust me when I say if they were to just leave, that is not a good thing for you, even if you don't like their brand, because it makes everything else more expensive and less, shall we say, competent. Like, if you want a little history lesson, I think, Joseph, you probably would agree, the Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, kind of fun systems, right? Mm-hmm. A large part of the reason those systems were so good is because that was when Nintendo and Sega were at their absolute, like, pinnacle. And so the only thing they could do to make to outperform the other one is they just had to make better games. And they had to offer you better deals. That's all they could do. There were no other perks. I mean, you could try. You could occasionally do those link systems. They both did some very limited X-band, like, online services that were back in the day. Sega got creative with things like the Sega Channel. Nintendo tried the Satellaview thing, stuff that never really panned out. But mostly, it boiled down to which system had the better games.
Or the games that you liked better, honestly.
Precisely. Yeah. And if you get to a point where, we were just talking about Nintendo and how their hardware is effectively, they don't even care what generation it physically is in as far as technology goes. So if a new game comes out and it's really just, hey, I'm a console gamer and it's only going to exist on PlayStation because of a default, then there's really no reason that game has to be affordable. There's no reason that game has to try harder. and there's no reason Sony can't just be like, the games cost $100 now. What are you going to do?
Exactly.
Like, we were at the beginning of this when we were talking about physical media. That's the other thing. These are locked ecosystems. So Sony is the only one that can produce those discs. Sony is the only one that control the PlayStation Network. That's not good. They have no competition inside that. Now, again, you would still have PCs, obviously, and I imagine a lot of people would flock to that. But at the same time, it's still the same problem, because one massive competitor that doesn't have to worry about finances kept everybody else honest. So to get rid of that, to get rid of that would cause a lot of problems. Anyway, I've been rambling. You go for it, man.
Yeah. So Microsoft, the Xbox console, gone, completely gone. In this case scenario, we have Sony with the PlayStation and Nintendo with whatever they have out at the time. But as we've established earlier when we were talking about the Switch Successor, what we would think about it, they're basically at this point in two divergent niches. Like, there's barely like any crossover in the games that are coming out. Like, sometimes like a third-party game will come out for both, or will come out on the Switch. Less so now. Like earlier in the gen, it was happening all the time. But at this point now, the gulf between the PS5 and the Switch is big enough that if you're making a game for the PS5, you're probably not going to be able to fit it onto the Switch. So they're basically, as of right now, there are rumors otherwise, not competing with each other. So Sony's only real competitor is Xbox, or in this case, in this hypothetical scenario, was Xbox. So you mentioned about like price increases, because there's no other game in town, but there's also not going to be a reasonable push for next gen hardware either, because we don't make a PlayStation 6 until we actually need one. But who cares? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Go try to play the cutting edge game on Nintendo, or go buy a Steam Deck? Like, without any competition at all, there's no incentive to actually move on to the next generation. There's no incentive to improve hardware. And honestly, they don't even need to they do need to make good games, because games are a luxury, and if they suck, people will stop buying them, Monopoly or not. But generally, they won't have to try as hard. And more... So it's like, if this hypothetical scenario happens, like, it could be the end of, like, what we think of as the video game industry. Because I was thinking about this, like, after I proposed the topic to you, and I was trying to think, okay, so our third console goes away. Is there anyone who can and will actually take Xbox's place and make a third console now? And honestly, I don't think so. I think there are only really two viable candidates who have either the motivation or the money to do it. And I don't think either of them are going to. Like, at this point, it would be Apple or Valve. And in Valve's case, they don't have the money to actually make an actual console, full-on retail release console, and at the scale of the Xbox or PlayStation. Apple has the money. They probably don't have enough give a damn to do it, or any desire to actually jump back into that market as like a full-blown console instead of just like making a streaming box or whatever.
Apple Arcade.
Right, yeah, they have Apple Arcade, but they're not...
That's the extent to which they care, and people forget it even exists.
Apple tried before with the Pippin, and the Pippin didn't necessarily fail because of the whole gaming, because it was a gaming thing. It failed because Steve Jobs came back and was like, no, axe all these clone stuff, and they did. But, like, the only time Apple tried to make a game console, it was a failure, even if, in theory, it might have been able to succeed. So,
Yeah, I mean, people were throwing out some other, companies, but this is just like people were basically just listing big companies at that point. They're like, "Oh, wouldn't it be interesting if Samsung did it?" And I'm like, "Well, they kind of did with the new one. They were like one of the last people to actually try that wasn't Sega, Nintendo, or
What would be Samsung's motivation to do it? Like Valve has the motivation because they have Steam. They already have infrastructure in place where they get a cut of games sold, but they don't have they're a private-ish company and don't have even they don't have the amount of money to actually scale up production enough to what they want. Like the Steam Deck is sold through Steam. That's it.
Yeah, yeah. So I agree with you on both of those. I'm just saying with the people, I'm just telling you basically what my comments section looked like. People were saying, "Oh, Google," and it's like they could try again because Stadia was a failure, and it's like Google doesn't want to make a physical console. They had that opportunity.
Yeah, if Google was going to do it, they would have done it instead of Stadia.
Yeah. And then I think Amazon was the other one they threw out there because at some point, wasn't it like the NVIDIA Shield was supposed to be an Amazon product only or something like that, but it was like a complete... I vaguely
Amazon was also trying to do a streaming thing at some point, and they do have game developers, but they came out with New World, which
point is like people were just listing big companies they thought could do it. The simple truth is there's nobody budding to do that because getting out of console hardware, like I miss Sega, but like the simple truth is like that was probably from a financial perspective one of the best things they did.
Oh yeah,
because
for sure.
A hardware division is incredibly expensive and very complicated, and you have a lot of issues that go with that. The only reason that we didn't feel that pain as much is because Microsoft kind of entered because Sega was leaving. It was like they were there together doing that. Like people forget that at one time Microsoft helped Sega make the Dreamcast. And at one point, Sega at least pitched the idea that they would help them with the Xbox and that it would just be like a cooperative thing that didn't pan out. But yeah, so I mean, having them completely drop out like that would be a lot. Go on.
Yeah, there's also something that a lot of people don't ever seem to take into account when they're talking about this whole possibility with Microsoft dropping out of the console business. Microsoft never wanted to actually make the Xbox in the first place. They made it because neither Sony or Nintendo would let them just like join up with them to make the software for their consoles, to actually get part of it with them into the living room. They thought the PlayStation was going to be taking over and basically get rid of the point of computers, and none of the OEM computer manufacturers wanted to make the Xbox because there's no money in making the hardware. So they made the original Xbox because they thought they needed to make a game console to stay relevant, and no one and every other option to not actually make the hardware itself didn't pan out, so they had to actually make the hardware.
With the ironic exception of Sega, if they had actually taken that deal, they wouldn't have had to deal with it.
Well, yeah, but Sega wasn't like a viable, necessarily a viable competitor at that point. Like they had the Dreamcast, but Sega did not have the money to continue.
Yeah, that was Sega's proposal to Microsoft at the time, was like, just fund us to do the Dreamcast some more, then we'll work together on your successor. But that just seemed too weird, I guess, to Microsoft at the time. But whatever, it doesn't really matter. But I agree with you. Like, the initial idea to get in there wasn't about making a video game console. It was just kind of protecting the PC side of things. And it kind of always has been, which is probably a large part of the reason they don't really care how much money they lose on the Xbox brand, because I don't know if you saw, like a couple weeks ago, Microsoft stock traded so high that they became the second company in history to be valued at over $1 trillion. Did you see that?
Nope, but it doesn't surprise me. And
the only other one was Apple. And it's like, yeah, they don't care how much they're losing on the game side of things, because they did succeed in that to that extent that they protected the living room from Sony. That's what they wanted. They protected the idea of PCs. You can make fun of Microsoft all you want. They're in your life daily if you're a PC user, because most likely you're using some iteration of Windows.
Yeah. Like there's...
Go ahead.
The thought process, like I said, the thought process was that the actual like PC computer was going to go away and give way to the consoles because of all the media things. That didn't happen. So at this point now, like Microsoft like has the Xbox because they have the Xbox and they're already committed, and they could afford to try to keep going. Like, and then they came up with Game Pass, which was part like we've always been saying that Xbox was the one that would lead first. Because they've been in the state of basically trying to transition out of hardware for a while.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about, too, because there's been some interesting feedback on that video, and somebody brought this up, and I thought it was a fascinating point. I don't even know if I have a really good counter to it, which is, the Xbox brand, when we talk about it and how it's competitive and it's significant, we are saying that from an American perspective. And that makes sense. We are Americans. But outside of North America, the Xbox has long since been mostly irrelevant. Like, it does exist in certain European countries. I think the only one that has any real significant presence in is the UK. It was doing well in Germany for a while, before. But now, most of Europe has effectively been taken over by the PlayStation division. Australia, you can kind of make a case for, but it's more so still PlayStation territory. And then if you look at Japan, like, it basically doesn't even exist anymore. In its entire lifetime, the Xbox One and the Xbox Series X combined have exactly one exclusive Japanese title. One. In 11 years. It's a game called Azido. It was like a very early Xbox One game. It is the only Xbox One game that came out in Japan that simply never came out anywhere else. 11 years to get one game. Now, I talked about this in my video before about how they actually made a legitimate effort with the original Xbox, much more so with the Xbox 360. The Xbox 360 has a very tragic tale over there that was mostly destroyed by Microsoft's own lack of understanding of the Japanese market. But the point I'm trying to make here is that if you want to see a little bit of what a world can kind of look like where the Xbox brand is not relevant, you can kind of look at Japan. Like, it does exist there, but it's basically like, if you want games, you're going to be getting a PlayStation or you're going to be getting a Nintendo Switch. The other thing that's interesting about Japan, though, is like, it also is not a place where PC gaming has ever really been super relevant. So, but the Japanese are very different from us as far as, like, I'm just going to say it, like, what they're willing to support and what they're not. National brand unity typically has a little bit more significance over there. So Sony's Japanese, Nintendo's Japanese, they're more likely to support it. But the Japanese also love their phones, and they play a lot of stuff on their phones now. So it's not a perfect example, but it's an interesting way to kind of look at a possible outcome of what not having Xbox around would be like. But then at the same time, if you factor in global economics, because Xbox is so relevant, or was, or kind of still is, whatever, in North America, it has to keep prices honest here. And if they're going to be honest here, especially on region-free systems, they're going to kind of keep it honest internationally. You know what I mean?
Exactly. Yep.
So their presence was always important, and always is important, even if they don't want to be there. So, I don't know, man. Like, we live in a very complicated world. What can I tell you? Economics is hard.
It is, yeah. We'll find out for sure what's actually happening, but like you said earlier, it's probable that Microsoft, at least for now, is not actually going to drop out of the console market from what we've heard, rumor-wise.
I agree. I think it's very... Here's my realistic worst case scenario. And again, we could all be, you guys can be laughing at us, be like, yeah, we already know this didn't play out this way or whatever. We don't know because at the time we're recording this hasn't happened yet. But it would not entirely shock me if what their basic decision was like, hey, We're obviously still doing Xbox stuff. We're not getting rid of that. Like, we're still going to have Game Pass and all that. But what we're going to do now is that we're going to start offering the option to Game Pass to be available on other platforms. It already is on PC. We're going to allow it to be part of the PlayStation infrastructure. We're going to allow it to be part of the Nintendo infrastructure. We're even going to have an iteration for phones, etc. Just because we don't really care as much about our hardware. Like, we're still going to support it. You can still buy new Xboxes. You can still get your updates. You can still get new games over there. It's just that we don't really care about this idea of exclusivity anymore. Because that would actually be very in line with what they want. Right. Which is just relevance, like software relevance. Because if Microsoft can be so integrated with consoles the way they are with computers, then there's like absolutely nothing that can stop them. Think of it this way. Maybe they don't so much want Xbox as a competitor. They want it to be the thing that like the OS essentially that everybody uses to launch video games, and they don't care which video games are on there.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yes, that's definitely a thing that they would want. And one thing that we should probably point out as far as Game Pass goes is that there's no way in hell it's going to end up on PlayStation. Sony's not going to let that happen anytime soon. They have their own competitor to it.
Yeah, exactly. So. Unless they cut some sort of deal that we don't know. The other thing that I mentioned this in the video, you have to remember that the Activision deal was so gargantuan and so many countries' governments were against it that we don't know what kind of deals they cut and made agreements to allow it to pass. It is possible that this is just them being like, all right, we own Activision, but we can't have games exclusively to us for like 10 years. We have no choice but to be like, okay, we're going to allow our games to exist on PlayStation and Nintendo simply because we have no option in the matter.
And then I guess if you have to do that with Activision, you might as well consider it for other titles.
Precisely, but that's just pure speculation. I don't pretend to know any of that. Well, again, we'll have more information soon, and this was just to discuss kind of worst case scenarios that were somewhat realistic. But yeah, it's a fascinating discussion all the same.
Yeah, one other thing is I could definitely see Game Pass's price go up if they're no longer in the console market, because now they have to actually make money off Game Pass.
Yeah, I guess that's the other thing. That's an interesting point, because they obviously have never really made money off the Xbox brand, and as you said, the initial reason to even be there was just to basically keep the PC division functional, which it clearly has done in spades. And so, if that's the case, if they're completely out of the hardware, like, do they start trying to make money on it, or do they just continue to kind of run it as it is, which is just, we don't really care how this does, because as long as there is no threat to the living room again, then everything's fine. You know what I'm saying? Yeah,
like at this point now, like, computers are not going to go away like how everyone thought like 15 to 20 years ago. Like,
dude, for those who don't know what he's talking about, I have to agree with you here completely, Joseph. I am old enough to remember when it was kind of being advertised to us that the PlayStation 2 could just be your PC and you didn't need a PC. Like, oh, it can go online and it can play movies. Like, what would you ever need? It's got a web browser, or at least that was what they were saying at the time. It's going to have a hard drive. You don't need a computer anymore.
And then, like, 5-6 years after that, everyone was saying that about smartphones, too.
Right. Yeah, that's true. I do remember a few years ago, people were like, yeah, you can't really get laptops and stuff anymore because, like, they don't need them, and, like, your phone just taking over. And it's like, ugh. And now that's kind of, dying off as well. Mm-hmm. Maybe this is just them playing that game of not allowing anything that is a direct threat to the PC as a concept to exist. As stupid as this may sound to everybody out there, about the whole idea that a PS2 could have been your home computer, you have to remember the PS2 launched in 2000. Okay? Home computers did not become kind of a even semi-standard thing until, like, 5 years earlier?
Yeah, sounds about right.
My family's first computer, we got it in like 1992 or 1993, and the only reason we had something that early was because my mom's company was like, you're required to have one of these for work purposes, so it was in our house. But, like, most people, the beginning of the concept of a home PC didn't exist until like the late 1980s. So even if you started at its most like earliest inception, when your average Joe was getting a computer, whether it was Apple stuff early on, like the Lisa and all that stuff, you're talking like at most, 15 years between like something like the Lisa and the PlayStation 2?
Yeah, sounds about right.
Now think about what year it was 15 years ago now.
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh. It hasn't been that. Time flies as you get older, everybody. So it's, only 10 years ago, it was 2014. So 2009. 2009. I remember 2009 like that was the year I graduated from college. So it doesn't feel that long ago to me. But that was 15 years ago. So all my point is that as absurd as stuff like that can be to look back on at the time, you can see why companies make the decisions they make in that moment. And yeah, maybe this is just that realization of time where they're just like, we don't really care how much we lose on Xbox because we succeeded in saving the PC, but we don't need to keep making hardware for it because we really just hate doing that. Although maybe you know more about this. Somebody was commenting about how Microsoft has apparently been dragging their feet on the next chip manufacturer for whatever their system would be, where Sony is not. Are you familiar with this story at all?
No, I'm not.
Yeah, I don't remember what the detail. I think it was like AMD or something like that. Like Microsoft is apparently non-committal to what kind of chipsets they would want to use on a next system. But then again, I'm not.
That's not a good sign because consoles have basically been standardized to use AMD chips at this point, except for Nintendo, who is using an NVIDIA chip. But
sure.
Like basically at this point, like the ever since like the PS4, Xbox One era, console architecture has basically been PC architecture. Like obviously, like there are multiple manufacturers of chips for PCs. Like there's Intel for CPUs and AMD. As far as GPUs go, there's NVIDIA, AMD, and also Intel. They've tried to get into the graphics card market. We'll see how well that actually works out for them once they have more than one generation of hardware under their belt. But if Microsoft's being non-committal to whatever chip they're going to be using, like, they're either going to go with AMD or they're going to be weird and go with NVIDIA or maybe go back to IBM if IBM's still actually making chips. I don't know if they are.
Yeah, to tell you the truth, I don't know. That's why I was hoping you knew more about it, because somebody kind of casually mentioned it. I didn't know much else about the story, so just take that with a grain of salt, everybody. But yeah, anything else you want to say on this?
No, I think we covered a lot of it. Everything I could think of at the moment about it. So,
I mean, honestly, we could probably talk about this like forever, but we probably shouldn't, just because
it's hypothetical.
We just don't have enough
process.
Information at the moment.
Yeah.
So we'll move on to the next one. So Joseph, thank you for picking that subject. And our last subject comes from Sinjit. And this one will be just kind of fun to talk about for historical purposes. And it's also interesting because we are talking about corporate motivations and all sorts of things. He specifically wanted us to talk about Atari. Remember them? He said, what if they had ended up distributing the NES? Could that have saved them? Or was there anything that could have saved them? So for those who don't know, let me give you a little history lesson here. Atari, which of course created the Atari 2600, they're basically the founder of the home console market and all that. They accidentally created Activision, funny enough, because they just pissed off so many of their devs who went off and created a separate company. After the success of the Atari 2600, or what then was known as the Atari VCS, they went off and they made a successor system called the Atari 5200, which was an outright flop. And they were less confident about their next system, which would eventually become the Atari 7800. Meanwhile, while this is happening, it's like 1983. So the video game crash hits in full. American video game systems are essentially dead. Atari doesn't really know what they're going to do. That same year, Nintendo launches a little system called the Famicom in Japan. Now, Nintendo basically wasn't a name outside of Japan that anyone was familiar with, save for one thing, which was Donkey Kong. Americans knew what Donkey Kong was, and people wanted to play Donkey Kong. They wanted to have Donkey Kong on stuff. It was big in the arcades, etc. So at some point, I believe it was in 1983, Nintendo was not super confident about their ability to just release a system in the United States. It was a market they didn't really know much about. They didn't know how to tackle. And again, the only thing they were known for was Donkey Kong. So they kind of looked at Atari, saw their situation, and said, look, everybody knows what Atari is. They make video game systems. What if we basically just give them the Famicom? They kind of reshape it. They can even call it the Atari whatever. We'll just make games for it, and then they just give us a percentage of every system sold. So this would have been Atari effectively releasing the NES, scrapping the 7800 entirely, and the two of them more or less just did a deal together. Now, this actually came all the way to the point of hands were shook, deals were signed, everybody was good to go, everybody agreed, yes, this is the best way forward. Ultimately, what kills this is that I think it was CES 1983, which is what, the Consumer Electronics Show, something like that. And that year, people from Atari attended a show and they saw Coleco's booth. Now, do you remember Coleco, Joseph?
Obviously I've heard of them, but remembering them, no, I was not alive.
I'm with you. I don't remember them either. I don't remember them personally, but I do know of them. I have a ColecoVision and so on. But anyway, Coleco is a computer company, another American computer company that made the ColecoVision, a direct competitor, etc. They were actually debuting their PC, which, funny enough, was called the Atom, as in my name. And so Atari saw that running. But what game they had on it was actually Donkey Kong. And so people at Atari were like, whoa. They went to Nintendo and they're like, did you give Donkey Kong to our direct competitor, Coleco? And they're like, yeah, anybody can use it as long as they pay for royalties. And so Atari and Nintendo kind of had a falling out over this because they basically misunderstood the situation with each other. Nintendo looked at it as like, we're just going to make our system and license it out to you, and you can just kind of sell it for us, and then you get to keep money, we get to keep money, everybody wins. And we're going to license our games, and Donkey Kong being the only successful thing we've got, over here anyway, to whoever is willing to pay for it. Whereas Atari kind of saw it as like, we want everything that is exclusive about Donkey Kong, and because that is what Nintendo is. You have to understand, Mario Brothers wouldn't exist for a few years. At least the Mario Brothers that we know from the NES, not the older arcade Mario Brothers, which did exist. If you guys remember, potentially, Nintendo used to actually develop games for Atari hardware. There was iterations of Donkey Kong and Mario Brothers, the older game on Atari hardware. Anywho, so the whole deal kind of fell apart right there. They tried to sort it out, but ultimately they just kind of didn't agree on it. And it is interesting to look back at, because you got to remember at that point in time, like, we can look back on it and be like, wow, what a stupid deal. Atari didn't take that deal. But you got to remember, the only thing anybody knew about Nintendo in North America was Donkey Kong. And the fact that Atari was seeing that it was just willy-nilly going to appear on ColecoVision machines, their direct competitor, they were like, what is the point of this anymore? They didn't really care. They already had their own system, or were about to, the Atari 7800, and they thought, why pay royalties to this weird Japanese company that didn't give us the only thing we wanted out of it, when we can just go it ourselves and keep 100% of the money? That was their thought process.
Now, was this before or after the video game crash?
This was basically during. So this was 1983. The crash had effectively already happened. This was them trying to claw their way out of it. And so, yeah, that didn't pan out. I think that ultimately was by 1984, that whole thing was totally dead. And then 1984, I think, is when Atari got sold off to Warner, and then that was when Jack Tramiel and all that came in, and it was like a whole different era. Now, the funny thing about that, though, is they actually had a second shot at this. In the late 80s, I don't remember exactly what year, I want to say 88 or maybe 88, 89, something like that. Maybe it would have to be at least 88. Sega actually went to Atari with the exact same proposal. So Sega releases the Sega Master System in Europe. It does very well. It does okay in Japan as the Mark III and all that. They didn't really know how to get into North America, and they didn't do well on their own. They ended up doing a deal with the toy truck company Tonka?
Yes.
So
and I know of this story, too.
Yes. So Sega does a deal with Tonka, and that's actually what kind of gets the Master System somewhat popularized a little bit in North America, as odd as that sounds. So at that point, when that kind of worked, Sega was under the impression that they were like, you know what? we really shouldn't try to release video game consoles ourselves in North America. We should always kind of link with somebody. Now, at that point, the 7800 was effectively completely dead. Atari was still a name. It didn't look like they were developing anything else as far as a new console, because the Jaguar was still years away. They kind of sat that generation out. They were mostly doing like, the XE computer and stuff. They weren't doing consoles. So effectively, Sega went to Atari with the same kind of offer. They're like, we have this thing called the Mega Drive, or what we would eventually know as the Sega Genesis. Would you be interested in releasing it as your thing? And you can just kind of cut us back money, et cetera, et cetera. And Jack Tramiel personally just, no. He just couldn't come to terms with the people at Sega. And he just kind of shot the whole thing down. So I was like, wow. I actually didn't know that until very recently. Because I was just like, Jack Tramiel, man, like if there was one guy who could have just, I don't know if there's anybody who could have done more damage to Atari than Jack Tramiel's whole story. Like that guy that guy just really killed that company. Now, to be fair, the way he ran the company, even if he had taken that deal, the most likely the Genesis would never have been the hit that it was. No. So, yeah.
That was entirely cool. Sega had good games, but the Genesis being a hit was Kalinske.
Yeah, it was Tom Kalinske, and Jack Tramiel would never have been able to get that system to be successful. It would have most likely ended up similarly to how the Atari 7800 ended up. So I'm very glad these stories didn't actually pan out. But, that's the interesting alternate history, is like, what would it have done? And in both cases, I think the Nintendo option might have worked for Atari, if we're going to say like what would have saved Atari. The NES was a distinct possibility, but it would have depended on how they marketed it. Nintendo, you have to remember, they had the genius idea of marketing the NES as a toy, not as a video game system, with Rob the Robot. They also changed the design completely to look like a VCR, because they knew VCRs, people liked VCRs, and they seemed like future tech. So, our video game system, which is a toy, is future tech, as opposed to the Famicom, which actually, admittedly, ironically, looks like an actual toy, which wouldn't have done as well. So I don't think Atari would have had that level of, let's say, insight. I don't think they would have been that self-reflective to understand that they were one of the primary reasons the video game industry crashed at all. So I don't know if they would have thought it was worth changing the design of the Famicom at all and marketing it as a toy. I think they would have probably...
They would not have done it as a toy. Yeah, they would have marketed it as a video game system. And I can't say for sure that the NES, under them, marketed as a video game system initially would have failed, but it would have been a lot more likely. Yeah, if only because retailers would have probably been like, no, video games are a done fad. They're not making money. No, we're not stocking this.
Do you know offhand when Super Mario Brothers on NES was released?
I don't, but that's a good thing that we have. Oh, okay.
Right, I just looked up. So it's 1985. Now that's key, because I can almost guarantee you, since this deal was happening in 1983, that they probably would have just kind of, rather than done that test market thing they did with the NES ultimately, they probably would have released the system in 1984. So that being the case, it's safe to assume that Super Mario Brothers would not have existed for another year, because it didn't. It didn't come out till 1985. So that means the thing that really you see where I'm going with this, that game would not have existed, and most likely would never have had the same kind of cultural impact. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
The NES coming out basically in 1985 in test markets, and then more of a wide release in 1986, really did them a huge favor, because by then, they had that game. And that game
they had Super Mario Brothers. They had the test market that, if you put a video game console in there, even if it's marketed as a toy, people will buy it.
Yep.
God, yeah. No, if Atari just flat out made a video game console and put it out there in '84 without Super Mario Brothers. Oh God.
Yeah. Think about how different history ends up being.
Yeah, like even ignoring the fact that Atari's reputation was probably completely in the toilet.
Yeah. I just, I don't think that could have worked. And so I find it a bad deal for Atari that they pulled out of this whole thing. But at the same time, I think it was a good thing for history. I think it was a good thing for us.
Yeah.
I don't think it could have saved them, though, because, certainly if they had the success the NES had, that of course would have saved them. But they wouldn't have had the success the NES had for the reasons we just cited. They most likely would have done just a bunch of stupid stuff. They probably wouldn't have changed the design of the Famicom, at all. And they probably would have just slapped Atari's name all over it. They would have probably launched it with... I don't even remember what the Famicom had in its first year, but it wasn't Mario Brothers. And it wouldn't have had Rob the Robot and all that. It would have just had, baseball. I mean, I don't even know what they had. It probably wouldn't have been that interesting. It would probably have been very similar to what Atari ultimately kind of offered with the 7800 anyway.
Yeah.
That's my thought process.
Oh, jeez.
Now, I don't know if this is connected to it or just a pure coincidence, but the Atari 7800 body design would ultimately, ironically, kind of have the last laugh because that same shell was recycled in Brazil officially as the case for the NES.
Oh God, really?
It's called the Phantom. It's just how Nintendo of Brazil and Atari all kind of came together. I don't know if that has anything to do with this or if it's just a coincidence, but that's the thing. You can look it up. It's the Phantom. It's basically an NES or Famicom cartridge slot inside of the shell of an Atari 7800, and that's how they actually got the system.
Wow.
I have no idea if it's connected or just one
of
those.
Not that I assume it mattered because Brazil was firmly Sega Master System territory.
Precisely.
But
just funny all the same. But, so to answer, is there anything I think could have saved Atari? Not really. I think Atari, their initial success was largely due to the fact, this is funny because we talked about monopolies. Atari really benefited from the fact that they really had no immediate competition because they basically created the idea of a home video game console. Now, it wasn't technically the first. That is certainly true. The Magnavox Odyssey is where I would give that credit to. But they were the first ones to have, interchangeable cartridges with completely different experiences on them, as opposed to the Magnavox Odyssey, where it only had 6 games. They were all basically the same thing, and all of them were bundled with the system, so there was no
Fairfield Child
content.
The
Fairchild
Fairfield
Channel F, yeah.
Channel F.
But if I recall correctly, part of what made the Atari 2600 work so well was that it was also vastly more affordable.
Yeah.
It's one of those things. But they kind of did everything right initially, but they also didn't go up against any other heavy hitters. The rest of the second generation is largely a cluster of chaos. Usually people just trying to steal from them, like Coleco having the Atari 2600 add-on. The Intellivision had an Atari 2600 add-on where you could just steal the games from another system.
And there's no quality control either. There was no licensing fees, and anyone could make an Atari game, basically.
Exactly. So basically, for every victory they had, they were mostly circumstantial because they just weren't dealing with real competition yet. And then as soon as they went head-to-head with actual competition, including themselves, the Atari 5200, they fell on their face. And everybody did. It was, honestly, it really wasn't until Nintendo came along you had someone kind of cleaning all this up. So, yeah, I don't think there was much with Atari's mindset that you really could have done to save them as a hardware manufacturer, because the one time I would argue they even kind of sort of did the right thing was the Atari Jaguar, and that really did not pan out at all.
No. But there's also another thing to think about, the NES probably wouldn't have saved them if they had it. Not only because they, would have screwed it up, but the fact is that they weren't dying when the NES was a thing. They didn't die as a hardware manufacturer into the Jaguar. That was several years after.
That is correct, yes. But to be fair, they sat out a whole gen. They sat out the 4th gen entirely.
Right, they were still doing, computer stuff, though.
Oh, yeah.
At the time,
they were still making things. Yeah, I know we were just talking about how time spans can seem a little weird and, motivations can change. 1983, video game crash happens, right? So that's when they're possibly about to make the NES. If you fast forward to 1993 is when we've entered the Jaguar, only 10 years later, and that's the beginning of the end. And then 1998, they fold completely and are sold off to Hasbro. 5 years between releasing their last system and being liquidated.
Yep.
I don't think there was much you really could have done to save them. They just, when Jack Tramiel was definitely the thing that killed them ultimately. But the decision to not do that Nintendo partnership, it's easy to look back on that and say, yeah, that was stupid. You guys missed out. But you also make the assumption that they would have had the same success. And given their history up to that point and their lack of understanding of anything Nintendo other than, oh, Donkey Kong is popular, they would never have made that work the same way. They would never have seen it. Like, you would have had basically the Atari 7800 with Donkey Kong on it, which, funny enough, I think does exist on the Atari 7800 anyway.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I do not think that would have panned out at all.
Yeah, like with a lot of these what-if questions on, like, if video game history went a certain way, it's the same deal. Like, it's easy to look back on the whole Nintendo Sony thing that ended up with the PlayStation happening, saying, wow, Nintendo was really stupid to cut off that deal and let Sony, like, make a PlayStation. But that ignores the fact that somehow the contract was, like, really, like, stacked in Sony's favor, and Sony was potentially planning on going into the console market themselves after that anyway. Same deal with the whole thing that we found out about with the whole Sega and Sony potential deal to team up during the 5th generation. That didn't happen because their engineers couldn't agree on what a combo system would be, or, you know, Sega not taking Silicon Graphics deal for the console and getting the hardware for what would have been the N64 as a Sega system. Like, it's easy to look back on and being like, wow, those are very stupid decisions, but in the moment, not necessarily.
Yeah, I actually ultimately think Nintendo made the correct decision with the PlayStation debacle, if you want to call it that. Just because, again, that's the part people don't focus on. They just say, oh, Nintendo's stupid, they just bailed. Do you ever think about why they bailed?
It makes perfect sense for Nintendo to have done what they did, and to be fair, it only seems like a bad idea nowadays because it made Sony become PlayStation, and PlayStation becoming
is a household thing. Yeah. Yeah, because, I mean, if you look back on that original situation, and not, if anybody wants the history lesson here, the deal they had come up together with was that Sony was going to make a disc-based format for Super Nintendos. Effectively, that was the point. The Sega CD competitor. That's all Nintendo really wanted out of them. And Sony was like, well, if we're doing that, can we also make, like, combined units that allow for the cartridges and the CDs? And Nintendo's like, yeah, sure, whatever. And so then Sony starts focusing on only doing that and not doing the add-on version. And then so they're like, okay, Sony will make a Super Nintendo compatible machine that Sony will get all the money for. And the disc format is 100% Sony, so they'll get all the money for that. And Nintendo didn't even care about those two things. What they cared about was that, oh, by the way, every single disc-based game for this combination machine, Sony gets 100% of the money for. And Nintendo's request, after all this was understood, was, well, that part's not reasonable because you're expecting us to develop games for your machine. You get 100% of the money, and we have no reason to do this. So can we renegotiate what that payment plan is? Sony says, no, basically go fuck yourself. And so Nintendo's like, screw this, we'll go to Philips. And that's how you got the Zelda CDI games. Like, Sony was completely unreasonable in that just because they technically had their signature on something. But it's like, well, that prevented that from ever occurring practically.
Yeah.
It was just, you know, it's like, okay, that's just how that went down. And it's so, whatever.
Yeah, but like, when you look at it that way, like, Nintendo, like, the only reasonable choice was to tear up that deal.
Yeah, they paired up with that deal. Then Sony goes over and hangs out with Sega for a while. It was a hilarious little era. But the point is, from these like alternate histories, like, history played out for a reason. You know, it went the way it did for a reason. Yeah, it's funny to kind of go back, not have enough context, and say like, oh, well, that was dumb. But once you have the context, you're like, oh, maybe it wasn't that dumb. Like, just once you understand why they did it, it makes sense. That's all. So Yeah. Could anything have saved Atari? Yeah. Hypothetically, yes. Would it have been these? Not really, because I just don't think they would have been smart enough to run the NES the way Nintendo did, and I certainly don't think they would have been able to run the Genesis the way Sega did. They would have just done what they did, which was just dump hardware out there, not be able to market it. They'd re-release Joust again, and that would be it. You know, like that's all they ever did.
Yeah. Like, God, it's amazing to think of like just how different things could have been and how worse the game industry would have ended up being if like one tiny little thing was different. Like
butterfly effect.
Yeah, like the NES goes to Atari. I mean, we'll probably have a gaming industry now, but it would have taken a while for it to get to where it was back in the NES era. Because it wouldn't have been then.
Yeah, I agree. And let me round this out by saying this. So, butterfly effect, we're focusing on, man, how much worse it could have got. Think about the other direction where something went wrong and it could have been a lot better, but we don't know that version of history. We were just talking about, like, I don't like Apple products. I'm no secret of that. But you mentioned before the Pippin. The one time Apple ever tried to make a video game system, the Pippin. I own one of these things. And the only reason they gave up on it is because Steve Jobs came back to Apple and cut it off. Imagine where he doesn't come back to it. And Apple decides, we're just going to keep supporting this. We're actually going to do this. We're going to get in there. At that point, it was what, like 1998? It wasn't that far removed from Sega about to leave. One of the most, eventually would become a more profitable company when they released the
Sony
iPod.
Jumping in for that matter.
Yes, exactly. Sony only got in 4 years prior. Apple was in an odd state at that point in time, and let's keep it on the record. Like they were nowhere near as successful as they would be a few years later when they dropped the iPod. That's 100% true. But imagine they actually roughed it out and they made the Pippin work. Everybody makes fun of the thing because they never usually have used it. They've only heard about it in obscure videos and things like that. It actually was the most powerful system of the entire fifth generation. It was certainly capable of a lot of things. It just wasn't utilized to do them. Now imagine for a second they had actually put their full weight behind it. We had really had a legitimate Apple console at the height of the whole, like, what was that? I think that was the height of the iMac era, wasn't it?
Yep.
Yeah, so like imagine that actually playing out. And they don't need Steve Jobs anymore. And maybe they do iPods, maybe they don't. Things can change drastically. Maybe the system ends up being really, really good because, you know, Sega is not doing much better. This certainly isn't helping them. And maybe they go third party earlier. We don't know. Maybe they never even bother with the Dreamcast. Who knows what that makes Microsoft do, by the way? Maybe they're like, Apple is our direct competitor. We have to get in now. Like they do it immediately. Or they join up with Sega because they're desperate for it. Like that. Think about how
Microsoft get Bungie if Apple has a viable console in the market, though?
Exactly. Does Halo ever even happen?
Well, Halo would happen because they were originally developing it for the Mac. But
exactly. But does it end up on the Pippin? Marathon did. Marathon did.
Put a port of Marathon and Marathon 2 on the Pippin, so probably.
Exactly. All I'm trying to say is history can go very different for any number of reasons. So for every decision where somebody like Jack Tramiel just cancels a deal with Sega or the guy before him cancels a deal with Nintendo, there's also a Steve Jobs that cancels a major corporation out of an industry. Like I'm not even saying it could have been better. It might have. We honestly don't know. It sounds scary because it's different than the version of the universe we grew up in. But maybe the iPlay, as they maybe would have, called the successor to the Pippin, who the hell knows, could have been amazing. You don't know. Because as much as I don't like Apple products, their concept of an ecosystem that is locked is actually very compatible with game consoles. Mm-hmm. So it's, I don't know.
Yeah.
Anyway, I guess that's really all there is to say about that. Maybe we can wax and aim some other time if we actually think they could have made it work, if anybody cares to hear about it. But for now, we should probably get going. What do you think?
Probably, yeah.
All right, then. Okay, so huge shout out there to Sinji. Thank you very much for picking that subject. Obviously, shout outs to our people from earlier. We got Spencer. Appreciate the support. Abdullah. Hopefully your car situation pans out. Rob, we hope you're feeling better. Loke, Michael Kelly, Sega Steve, Tim Inman, Trey Wagner, thank you all again for the support. Obviously, everybody listening, whether you're a Patreon backer or not, appreciate that. If you could subscribe, we appreciate that too. Joseph, obviously, thank you for being the heavy hitter who actually was able to make it today. I appreciate that.
Again, thanks for having me.
Always. Rob, hopefully you feel better. Thank you much, everybody, for watching. Please like, comment, subscribe. Check out all the social media stuff in the description. I've got Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, Discord, Patreon, obviously, Spreadshirt, and the Travel Channel. Appreciate the support. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you all later.